You'll hear a lot of shit talked about the music that was on the Sega Genesis. In a way, I can actually understand a lot of it. Its main competition at the time had been the Super Nintendo, a machine capable of doing samples. What that meant was that much of its music was patterned after the sounds of actual real-life instruments. Trumpets, horns, that sort of stuff, and the results were quite good. On the other hand, the Genesis used something called FM synthesis, which, to put it as simple as possible, it mainly used electronic generated sounds to create its music. While this could produce some fantastic results itself, when it was bad, it could be really bad. Sometimes a soundtrack could be reduced to nothing but various fart noises and random ear-piercing shrieks. Sadly, many Western developers just had no skill with the Genesis sound hardware, and produced more games than I care to count with some truly embarrassing audio. But as with many things in life, you can't let the bad deter you from finding the good. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at my top 10 games on the Genesis with the best music. These games are of course personal and handpicked by me to represent the very best on the platform. So let's take a look at my choices for the top 10 Sega Genesis soundtracks. Before we jump in, I want to mention some games that I think could easily make a top 10 given the right person and their taste in music. A lot of the reasons why these types of lists seem to be shuffled around are usually based on the smallest of things, and I think all of these games are worth an honorable mention. The Battle Mania games had some really nice music that pumped along to the shooting action. These kinds of games need a great soundtrack to keep the adrenaline up, and it has that and then some. The Adventures of Batman and Robin has a hard-hitting soundtrack with some strong contenders as well. Much of it is an acquired taste, but no less impressive. Mega Turrican is another one of my favorites. It's the emotional kind of music that gives you goosebumps while you play. Gunning down bad guys has rarely sounded so good. ALISIA DRAGOON was a surprise entry on the Genesis that showed off some great music. While it was an action game, the music sounded very much like something you'd hear from a role-playing game, and the mix was quite unlike anything you heard at the time. The ECCO games had some really cool music too. Some of it was relaxing, some of it dark and scary, and some of it just plain alien. It made for a heck of a unique soundtrack. And speaking of Alien, Alien Soldier by Treasure has some impressive stuff going on too. This game is fast and hard, so the music had to keep up to make the experience the best it could be. No trouble there, and it's easily one of the better games they produced. Thunder Force 4 wasn't just one of the best looking games on the Genesis, it also happened to be one of the better sounding games as well. Pretty much every track is outstanding and really adds to the mood and ambiance of the stages and gameplay. And you know you can't talk about the Genesis and not mention the Sonic games. All of them had tracks that could easily be added to a best of list. The original is a personal favorite when it comes to music, but the others deserve praise as well. Gauntlet 4 has a couple of tracks that could be argued as the best the machine ever produced. Rarely has music fit its gameplay and environment so well. I wouldn't blame anyone for having it as number 1 in their own top 10. HERZOG ZWEI was another early game that had some really memorable tunes. If you spent time mastering this one, you likely burn these tracks into your psyche forever. And of course guys, there are many others, but I'd be here for hours trying to cover them all. The Genesis had some really great music, but there can only be 10 for this video, so let's get to them and see what I've got. Kicking off our list at number 10 is a truly memorable Genesis game start to finish. I first played Shinobi III not long after it was released in September of 1993, which also happened to be the beginning of my final year of high school. This was my anthem, the soundtrack that led up to my freedom of driving my own car, staying out as late as I wanted, and hanging out with my friends. The first and most obvious track you need to listen to is Whirlwind, a powerful piece that played in the hoverboard stage, but there are others that are just as nicely composed. And I really loved how each selection kept a touch of Eastern-influenced sound, holding on to that connection with the ninja theme. Shinobi 3 looked good and played great, but it simply wouldn't have been the same without that incredible music. There's no question that in 1991 you felt things start to shift in the popularity of the Sega Genesis. Sonic was out and burning up the charts, and games like Streets of Rage were bringing in a whole new audience of gamers. By the end of 1992 though, you knew the Genesis was going to be an anchor of the American gaming market for the rest of that generation. Even Konami finally jumped on board, and their release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The HYPERSTONE Heist was a big one. These beat-em-ups always played well and really captured the feeling of the cartoon series, and boy did the Genesis game sound spectacular. The original arcade version used a Yamaha sound chip itself, so the Genesis tunes sounded as if they were lifted right from the original hardware. Every track here did the hardware justice, and every time I hear it, it reminds me of just how far Sega made it during its 4th generation ascent. This one here will likely be contentious, but I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't include it. In 1991, I discovered Road Rash through a friend. It absolutely blew me away, and the unique music really grew on me the more I played it. It's so funky yet so perfectly matching the tone of the on-screen action. A number of Electronic Arts games would have similar music, but this one always stood out and had a really unique feel. Road Rash was a game I would play daily back then, and while its sequels on the Genesis would improve a number of things over the years, they never did quite sound as special as this one. In October of 1990, my mother surprised me with an early Christmas present, a full retailed price game, something I rarely had seen in my life at that point. The game was ESWAT City Under Siege. She had just graduated from her college courses, gotten a new job, and to celebrate, she took me to KB Toys and allowed me to pick out any game I wanted. I had never had it so good, man. The utter jubilation of standing there at the game rack with the freedom to pick out any game I wanted regardless of price still sends shivers of excitement down my spine 30 years later. I picked a good one too. ESWAT may not have been directly based on the arcade game, but it was better in some ways. Now a more robust action platformer, it had stages with more to do, enemies with more variety, and man did I love the music. Some of it was low-key and dark, matching the tone of the setting, and some of it was fast and hard-hitting, like when a boss suddenly appeared on the screen. Aside from being a damn solid soundtrack, it also reminds me that I never would have amounted to shit without the support and love of the woman that gave me life. As you have heard me say a few hundred times, I got my Genesis at the Christmas of 1989. I actually hadn't been impressed by many of the games I played first, but that all changed when I finally got my hands on Revenge of Shinobi. For weeks I had seen it sitting on the shelf at my local Suncoast Motion Picture store, the bold $70 price label reminding me that my broke ass was never gonna own it. Fortunately, I had friends better off than me, and man did it make one hell of an impression. I quickly saved up from odd jobs and bought it on my own, and it remains one of my favorites today. It's the first time I recall seeing the composer's name on the title screen of a game, and once I heard it, I understood why. The music here needs no more words to sell it. It speaks for itself just fine. In the summer of 1991, I was loving my Sega Genesis and was trying to soak up as much software as I possibly could. Whether it was renting, borrowing, or buying, I wanted to play everything. So when Midnight Resistance landed, you can bet I was there to partake in some Contra-like run-and-gun action. And while this one certainly plays decent, I had no idea the music was about to become some of my favorite on the entire platform. You need to understand the shock this was, because it absolutely destroys the arcade version in every single way. This did not happen very often at this point in gaming, a home game that put the more powerful arcade hardware to shame. But it's unmistakable. This game represents some of the finest sound the Genesis ever produced. After the first game had been so good, I was really looking forward to Streets of Rage 2. It came out during the holiday months of 1992, and established yet again that Koshiro-san knew the Genesis hardware like so few others. The dance mix style music was so fitting to the combat-laden gameplay and even set the mood for every stage before the first punch or kick was even thrown. Many consider it the best soundtrack on the entire platform, and I certainly won't argue with them. There are so many good pieces here, and amazingly, many of them sound quite different from one another. Sega and its partners set out to make an arcade experience here, and they succeeded in every way. It looked the part, played like a champ, and had the music that defined a generation for many people. When you bring up music on the Genesis, this game has to be in that conversation every single time. Waiting for a Sega Castlevania game was torture back then. The series had grown into multiple entries on Nintendo's machines, and it seemed the Sega faithful were simply not meant to enjoy one for themselves. It would be damn near 1994 before that changed, but the wait had been well worth it. Castlevania Bloodlines was a great title that provided all the thrills I had so wanted on my Genesis. Great special effects, tried and true gameplay, and of course that epic and unforgettable soundtrack. You got a bunch of new entries that kicked all sorts of ass, and you got some classics remade just for this version. It's all wrapped up into one killer game that represented the series well, and finally gave Sega owners a Castlevania to call their own. My best friend at the time and I wanted it so badly, we actually wrote a bad check for it just so we could get it home. It wound up costing us $20 more to cover that fee, but we didn't regret it for a single second. It took Batman a little longer than expected to make its way to North America, but when it finally did, I fell in love with it instantly. Aside from being a really nice action platformer, it also has some unforgettable music. And it was funny because it wasn't trying to mimic the stuff from the movie and instead went in a completely new direction. I think this was definitely the right choice, as trying to reproduce the real instruments from the theatrical score would only mean it would have been different and a lot less impressive. Instead, all the new music was able to stand on its own with no comparisons to anything else, allowing it to really carve its own path to success. I actually feel this is something that more composers should have done with the Genesis. Instead of trying to copy what was done elsewhere, they really should have played directly to the advantages of the Genesis Yamaha sound hardware. That brings us to number 1, the very best music on the Genesis. Many games can be argued to belong here, but for me, it has to be 1991's Streets of Rage. If you watch my channel, you know my story with this game was one of pain and discovery. I had torn my knee up during a football injury that summer, and not being able to do much of anything in the following weeks, it was Streets of Rage that got me through it. Every track here just fits. Whether it's the bright lights of downtown or the dimly lit back alleys, you'll rarely encounter music so well suited to the environments it's paired with. I love how so much of it has little touches like ambient sounds as well. Sometimes you get what sounds like sirens and dogs barking, and it really adds to the tone and overall effect. We all have that one game that best defines our entire experience with a platform. When it comes to music, that game for me is the original Streets of Rage. Now that we have our 10 games, there are no doubt some of you sitting there angry that one or more of your favorites didn't make the list, and many more of you at least disagreeing with the order I have chosen. When I make these lists, my goal isn't to tell you that this is the definitive ranking and any other opinions are invalid and wrong. Quite the contrary, in fact. These lists are highly personal and intricately tied to my experiences. It's impossible for me to provide a list that considers your own emotional attachments, so instead of directly comparing the two, I instead encourage you to share your own choices and why. I would much rather hear why a game makes your own list instead of hearing why you disagree with mine. While there can be common ground and similar opinions when it comes to best of lists, rarely will you see two exactly alike. There's a reason for that, and personal taste and how you came upon these games almost always dictates it. Genesis music in particular has a massive divide among its fans. While I favor the Japanese produced stuff, I have seen many Genesis fans praise even its gems-driven offerings. It makes me realize that no matter what I feel and love, my opinion will never be a substitute for someone else's experience. I can feed you a pile of bullshit like I'm trying to be objective and look at things impartially, but really that's nearly impossible in this sense. The very nature of the emotion great music can sum up is at the very heart of what makes it so appealing. To strip it down to its most basic ingredients and overanalyze it completely defeats the purpose. In essence, what matters here is not the order or the games chosen, but our ability to share with one another what it all means to us. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for listening, and I will catch you next time.